My name is Amanda Nolan. I'm 34, and until that night I thought my life was predictable in the safest way possible. Not perfect, but stable enough that I stopped questioning it. I'd been in the same relationship for years, long enough to share a home, split expenses, and talk about the future like it was already decided, just postponed. There was no ring, no rush, just routines that made everything feel settled. That evening didn't feel any different at first. I was sitting at a rooftop steakhouse in Austin, waiting for a work-related event to start. Nothing personal, nothing emotional, just one of those dinners you attend out of obligation. As I reached for my glass, my phone vibrated on the table. The message was familiar, almost automatic by now. "I'm busy at work. Love you." I glanced at it, didn't smile, didn't respond, and let the screen fade. Then I looked up. 2 tables away, in the same restaurant, I saw him. I recognized everything instantly: the posture, the way he leaned forward when he was engaged, the relaxed confidence he only had when he thought he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He wasn't on a call, he wasn't distracted. He was focused on the woman across from him. I watched them talk, watched her laugh, watched his hand settle where it didn't belong, slow and familiar. When she leaned in and kissed him, it wasn't rushed or awkward. It was easy, comfortable. The kind of kiss you share when you're not worried about being seen. I didn't stand up. I didn't confront him. I didn't react at all. I stayed where I was, breathing steadily, watching everything click into place. If you want to see how one ordinary lie can quietly destroy an entire life without a single raised voice, subscribe now. This story doesn't explode. It tightens. I picked up my phone, adjusted the angle, and took my time, because for the first time all night I wasn't in a hurry anymore. A few seconds passed before my mind caught up with what my eyes were already confirming. I didn't need to hear their voices or lean closer to understand what was happening, because their body language did all the talking: the way he angled himself fully toward her, the way she matched his posture without hesitation, the way neither of them seemed aware of the room beyond their table. This wasn't a stiff dinner between coworkers or an awkward meeting that crossed a line by accident. When his hand settled over hers, it did so naturally, like it belonged there. And when she smiled back at him, it wasn't polite or guarded. It was familiar. That was the moment I knew she wasn't just someone from work. Her name was Haley James, though I didn't know it yet, and I didn't need to. I watched the smaller details instead of the obvious ones: the way his shoulders relaxed, as if he'd dropped a weight, the way his voice lowered, the way the space between them disappeared, without either of them noticing. When she leaned in and kissed him, it happened smoothly, without surprise, without that brief pause people have when they're unsure. It was a kiss that assumed privacy, a continuation, rather than a mistake. I didn't feel the surge of anger I'd always imagined would come with a moment like this. What I felt instead was a clean, unsettling clarity, the kind that strips away every excuse you've ever made. I reached for my phone, slowly, deliberately, careful not to draw attention, and angled it toward their table, framing the scene the way a third party would see it. The placement of the chairs, the glasses, the closeness, the unmistakable intimacy, making sure not to capture faces, not to give anyone room to argue intent later. The image showed exactly what it needed to, and nothing more. Then I opened our message thread. I didn't type out an explanation or a question because there was nothing left to ask. I kept it short, neutral, almost polite. "Good luck with work and your partner." I attached the photo and pressed send. From where I sat, I saw the precise moment his phone vibrated. At first, he didn't look worried. He smiled, faintly distracted, still playing his role, assuming the message was harmless. Then he glanced down. The shift in his expression was immediate, like a switch flipped behind his eyes. The color drained from his face, his jaw tightened, and his gaze shot up, scanning the room in quick, panicked movements. His phone slipped from his hand and hit the floor hard enough to draw a few glances from nearby tables. Haley pulled back, startled confusion flashing across her face as she followed his sudden change in focus. She spoke to him, but he didn't respond. He stared straight ahead, frozen, exposed, clearly unprepared for this version of reality. I stayed where I was for another moment, not because I needed to, but because I wanted my movements to remain calm, unhurried, intentional. I finished the water in front of me, stood up, and smoothed my jacket as if nothing unusual had happened. I didn't look at them as I passed their table. I didn't acknowledge the chaos quietly unfolding behind me. Near the front of the restaurant, I noticed the manager, Ben Foster, dealing with an unrelated issue. His voice steady, his demeanor professional, the kind of person trained to handle disruptions without absorbing them. I walked past him, pushed open the door, and stepped outside into the night air. I didn't feel the need to turn around. I already had what I came for, even if I hadn't known I was looking for it when the night began. Later that night, I didn't go home. I drove past the familiar turn without slowing, letting the distance stretch naturally instead of forcing myself to decide anything out loud. My phone started vibrating again before I reached the next intersection, his name lighting up the screen like a reflex he expected me to answer. I didn't. A voicemail followed almost immediately, his voice tight and rushed, apologetic in tone, but careful with words, the kind of apology that sounds more strategic than emotional. Another call came before the message finished, then another, then a text. I glanced down once while stopped at a light and saw the progression unfold in real time. The first messages were soft, asking where I was, saying he was worried, promising he could explain everything if I just picked up. Minutes later, the language shifted. He said I was reacting too fast, that I hadn't let him talk, that I was making assumptions based on one moment. The concern faded, replaced by irritation threaded between the lines. By the time I pulled into a quiet residential street, the messages had turned sharp. He accused me of blowing things out of proportion, of turning a private situation into something unnecessary, of creating problems where there didn't need to be any. The last message I read landed differently than the rest. He said I was making him look bad at work, that people were starting to ask questions, that my silence was damaging him. I read it once, then again without responding, my thumb hovering over the screen only long enough to scroll. When the phone rang again, I powered it off and placed it face down on the passenger seat. I didn't feel relief or satisfaction, just a steady quiet, the kind that comes when there's nothing left you're willing to negotiate. I finished the drive without turning on the radio, without checking the time, without thinking about what I'd left behind. The lights were already on when I pulled up in front of my sister's house, the same warm glow spilling through the windows like it always had. I didn't call ahead. I didn't text. I walked up to the door and knocked once. Brooke Nolan opened it, took one look at me, and stepped aside without a single question. I walked in, set my bag down near the entryway, and stood there longer than necessary, adjusting to the stillness. She didn't rush me or ask what happened. She didn't offer advice or reassurance. She told me I could stay as long as I needed and went back to what she'd been doing, as if my presence didn't require explanation. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the blank television screen, noticing the small sounds of the house settling around us, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of a clock I'd never paid attention to before. My phone stayed dark where I'd left it. When Brooke returned with a mug and set it on the table in front of me, she didn't sit too close or fill the silence with conversation. She gave me space without making it feel like distance. I didn't tell her what I'd seen. I didn't repeat the words he'd sent or the accusations already forming behind them. She didn't ask. We existed in the same room without needing to define the moment. After a while, I took my phone out of my bag, powered it on long enough to see the notifications stack up again. Missed calls, more messages, each one more urgent than the last, then turned it off once more and slid it back out of sight. Brooke watched without comment. She showed me the guest room, fresh sheets pulled tight, a lamp left on low, the door left open just enough to let the hallway light spill in. I lay back, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling while the house settled into quiet. Somewhere else he was still talking, still explaining, still trying to control the version of events that made him comfortable. I wasn't listening anymore. The next morning moved forward, whether I was ready for it or not. I hadn't checked my phone yet when I heard a knock at the front door, firm and deliberate, the kind that expected an answer. Brooke was already up, already moving through the house with quiet purpose, and she reached the door before I had time to react. I stayed where I was, listening without eavesdropping, able to tell from the tone alone that the conversation was being kept short by design. There was no argument, no raised voice, just a controlled exchange that ended with the door closing again. When Brooke walked back into the room, she didn't dramatize it. She said he'd come by, said she told him I wasn't available, and said he didn't argue. That was all. I nodded and didn't ask for details. Not long after, my phone rang. It wasn't his number this time. It was his mother. I let it ring through once before answering, already aware that this call wouldn't be about concern. Her voice was calm, composed, practiced in the way people sound when they believe they're speaking from a position of reason. She didn't ask how I was doing or whether I was safe. She spoke about appearances, about how situations like this look from the outside, about how quickly things can spiral once people start talking. She said what I was doing reflected poorly on everyone involved, that leaving so abruptly made things seem worse than they were. I stayed silent and she filled the space easily. She talked about commitment, about how relationships aren't perfect, about how adults work through uncomfortable moments instead of walking away from them. She said families survive mistakes, but they don't survive abandonment. When I still didn't respond, her tone shifted slightly, the warmth thinning just enough to reveal expectation underneath. She said choosing to step away like this was selfish, that it showed a lack of maturity, that I was prioritizing my own feelings over the stability of a family that had already been built. She said I would be remembered as the person who gave up instead of fixing what was broken. I listened to every word without interrupting, without defending myself, without offering her anything she could push back against. When she finished, I thanked her for sharing her perspective and ended the call. I didn't sit with the phone afterward. I set it down and let the room stay quiet. That quiet didn't last long. Before the afternoon settled in, an email arrived from him. It was long, carefully written, formatted to look reasonable, the kind of message meant to hold up if someone else ever read it. He explained the situation step by step, framing it as a misunderstanding, fueled by stress and poor communication. He apologized again, but the apology felt secondary, tucked between paragraphs that redirected blame and softened intent. He asked me to reconsider my reaction, to slow down, to think rationally instead of emotionally. As the message went on, the language became more calculated. He mentioned consequences, how situations like this can escalate unnecessarily, how silence can be misinterpreted. He brought up work, reputation, professional standing, suggesting that my refusal to engage was already creating problems for him. He didn't threaten me directly, but the implication was clear enough. This wasn't a message meant to repair anything. It was a message meant to document his position. I read it carefully, noticing how every sentence protected him first, how concern and self-preservation were layered together in a way that felt deliberate. I didn't respond. I didn't forward it to anyone. I closed the laptop and sat there long enough to recognize the shift that had taken place. He wasn't trying to talk anymore. He was preparing to defend himself. By the time the morning gave way to afternoon, the decision formed without drama or emotion. It wasn't fueled by anger or fear. It was simply the next logical step. I opened my contacts, scrolled past names I'd never expected to skip over, and selected one I hadn't imagined needing. I scheduled the appointment, ended the call, and sat back, knowing that whatever this had been before, it had crossed into something else entirely. A few days later, I sat across from Carol Stewart in an office designed to keep emotion out of the room, neutral walls, minimal furniture, nothing that invited comfort or judgment. She let me speak without interruption as I laid out the facts, plainly how long we had lived together, how expenses were shared, what had been paid jointly, and what had started to unravel once communication stopped being mutual. She didn't ask how I felt or whether I was coping. Every question she asked was practical, focused on structure rather than sentiment. When I mentioned the house, she paused and asked about renovations not casually, but with intent. I told her about the upgrades we'd paid for over the years, how costs were split informally, how some payments came from joint accounts, while others came from personal savings. Carol explained that cohabitation without marriage often creates financial exposure people don't anticipate, especially when improvements to property are involved. Renovation expenses, she said, can be reframed during disputes as contributions toward ownership or leverage in negotiations, depending on how records are presented. She asked whether I had receipts, bank statements, or messages referencing those payments, and when I said I did, she nodded as if checking off a box. Then she moved to assets more broadly shared accounts, recurring transfers, overlapping subscriptions, explaining how even small routine transactions can be pulled apart later to suggest dependency or obligation where none was intended. The conversation shifted again, this time toward reputation. Carol asked about my work, how visible my role was, and whether my name carried weight professionally. She didn't dramatize the question. She said that when personal relationships collapse abruptly, especially under circumstances that leave one person exposed, retaliation doesn't always come in obvious forms. It often comes as narrative control. She warned me that people who feel cornered tend to reframe events quickly, not to tell the truth, but to regain footing. Accusations of instability, exaggeration, or emotional volatility are common, not because they're accurate, but because they introduce doubt. Once doubt exists, she explained, it becomes harder to separate fact from interpretation. She told me not to assume restraint simply because things had been quiet so far. Silence, she said, often signals preparation. Carol advised against engaging further unless absolutely necessary. No explanations, no clarifications, no attempts to appear reasonable. She emphasized that every message sent in moments like this becomes part of a record, whether intended or not. Her recommendation was simple and unambiguous: document everything, preserve all communication, and keep responses minimal and factual if contact could not be avoided. She cautioned me against sharing details loosely, even with people I trusted, because information has a way of moving faster than context. As she spoke, the situation reorganized itself in my mind. What had felt personal and chaotic was beginning to reveal a predictable pattern. This wasn't about resolution anymore. It was about positioning. Carol asked if I was considering taking action against him, and I told her I wasn't interested in escalation or punishment. I didn't want leverage for retaliation. I wanted boundaries that couldn't be rewritten. She accepted that without comment and said, defensive strategy doesn't require aggression to be effective, only consistency and restraint. Before I left, she handed me a list instead of reassurance: bank records, renovation invoices, account histories, communication logs, a practical inventory that reframed the past as documentation rather than memory. Walking out of her office, nothing felt lighter, but everything felt defined. That evening, I began organizing quietly, saving emails without rereading them, pulling statements I'd never thought twice about, and limiting communication to silence, unless it served a clear purpose. There was no satisfaction in it, and no sense of victory, only the steady understanding that whatever came next would be handled deliberately, not emotionally. A few days later, when the noise finally settled into something manageable, I noticed how patterns reveal themselves once you stop chasing explanations. It started with a detail that didn't fit something too polished about Haley's professional presence, a resume-like profile that read more like a carefully edited shield than a real person. I followed that instinct without urgency, checking only what was publicly accessible: company pages, archived bios, corporate filings, nothing private, nothing hacked. That was when the first contradiction surfaced: her name tied to a consulting firm known for strict non-disclosure and conflict clauses, followed by another record that hadn't been updated: a marriage still legally intact, shared assets still listed under both names. The picture was suddenly very clear. Haley wasn't just involved in something reckless, she was standing on obligations that could collapse if exposed. I didn't feel anger or satisfaction when I confirmed it, only a quiet certainty that Eric had once again attached himself to a situation he didn't fully understand, assuming consequences would land on someone else. I didn't reach out to Haley, and I didn't warn Eric. There was no confrontation, no message asking for honesty. I gathered only what was verifiable: public documents, timestamps, links that spoke for themselves without commentary. Then I sent that information to exactly where it belonged: her spouse's publicly listed professional email. No subject line, no explanation, no framing. Just the facts as they existed. I didn't wait to see if it was opened, and I didn't check for a reply. Once it was sent, I closed my laptop and went on with my day. The reaction didn't come from me, it unfolded around me. Haley disappeared first. Her social media went dark: profiles either deleted or locked. Her name quietly removed from the firm's site as if it had never been there. Messages stopped delivering, calls went straight to voicemail, and then, even that stopped working. There was no apology, no denial, just silence, sharp enough to be its own admission. Eric's response was the opposite. His calls began stacking up one after another, his voice shifting each time he left a message. Confusion giving way to accusation, accusation sliding into panic he tried badly to disguise as frustration. He asked what I had done without ever naming an action, accused me of crossing lines without identifying which ones, warned me that people were starting to ask questions he couldn't answer cleanly. And they were. I heard about it indirectly: meetings postponed, a supervisor requesting clarification, a client hesitating where there had never been hesitation before. The story Eric had been telling depended on silence from everyone else, and that silence was gone. I didn't correct anyone, and I didn't volunteer context. When messages came through asking me to confirm or deny rumors, I didn't respond at all. Silence wasn't a tactic at that point, it was consistency. Eric's tone deteriorated quickly. One message framed everything as something that could still be handled like adults if I would just talk to him. Another accused me of intentionally damaging his reputation by refusing to engage. A third warned that I was forcing him to defend himself. I didn't reply to any of them. I didn't explain my reasoning or label my actions. I hadn't announced anything, accused anyone, or demanded accountability. I had simply stopped absorbing consequences that weren't mine. Whatever name people wanted to give what followed, revenge, exposure, sabotage, it didn't come from my mouth. I hadn't claimed responsibility, and I wasn't interested in defending a narrative. The truth didn't require my interpretation to function. As Eric unraveled under pressure coming from directions he hadn't anticipated, I stayed where I was, focused on protecting my boundaries and letting events move forward without my supervision. I didn't need to call what I had done anything at all. Other people would decide that for themselves. Not long after the situation stopped evolving on its own, Eric made a move that felt calculated but poorly timed, the kind of reaction people choose when they believe aggression can replace control. A formal complaint surfaced through official channels, carefully worded to suggest concern rather than accusation, claiming that my behavior had been erratic, emotionally unstable, and increasingly inappropriate. The language was deliberate, structured to imply that I was acting irrationally and that my silence was a form of manipulation. It wasn't a lawsuit, but it was meant to build a record, one that framed him as the reasonable party dealing with someone unpredictable. When Carol Stewart reviewed it, her response was immediate and restrained. She explained that this tactic was common when someone felt cornered and attempt to reverse roles before facts became fixed. We didn't respond defensively or rush to refute every line. Instead, everything moved forward through standard procedure. Documentation was requested. Timelines were laid out. Every interaction was cataloged without commentary. The process didn't ask who felt wronged, it asked what could be verified. That distinction mattered. As part of the review, third-party confirmation was required, including objective details from the restaurant where the initial incident occurred. Ben Foster, who had been managing the floor that evening, responded with professional clarity. He confirmed that the reservation had been made under Eric's name, that the seating request specified privacy and timing, and that the arrival and departure windows matched the records already submitted. Without inserting opinion, he also noted that staff had observed conduct at the table that required quiet oversight, extended physical contact that exceeded what was typical for a public dining space, and prompted internal notation. Security logs aligned with his account timestamps, matching both the reservation system and the metadata attached to the image already in evidence. None of it described intent or motive. It simply established what happened when it happened and who was responsible for initiating the setting. As these neutral details were compiled, the focus of the inquiry shifted. Attention moved away from my alleged instability and toward the inconsistencies in Eric's narrative. His claim that I had created a scene or engaged in harassment unraveled when records showed I had left the restaurant calmly, that I had not approached his table, and that no direct contact occurred afterward. Communication logs demonstrated that every attempt to re-engage came from him. Repeated calls, messages, and emails sent after I had disengaged completely. Eric was asked to clarify gaps in his account. Then he was asked again when his explanations changed tone. Then once more, when those explanations conflicted with documented facts. Each request narrowed his options. The complaint he had filed to establish leverage began doing the opposite. What emerged wasn't a dramatic confrontation, but a clear pattern. When challenged, Eric adjusted his story. When pressed, he reframed his intentions. When evidence contradicted him, he shifted blame toward perceived misunderstandings. The process didn't accuse him outright, but it stripped his claims of credibility. The final determination was brief and procedural. His complaint was found to lack sufficient basis, no further action was warranted, and the matter was closed. There was no penalty issued and no public statement made, just a quiet resolution grounded in records rather than emotion. Any future attempt to revive the narrative would now be viewed in context weighed against a documented history of inconsistent claims. Throughout the entire process, I remained exactly where I had been: cooperative, precise, and silent, unless required to speak. I didn't push for retaliation or commentary. I didn't seek validation from the outcome. The truth returned without spectacle, reinforced by timestamps, confirmations, and third-party accounts that had no reason to protect or punish anyone. By the time the review ended, Eric had lost the one thing he had been trying to preserve: control over how the story was told. His attempt to make me appear unstable had instead anchored the record in facts he could no longer reshape, and that reality followed him forward long after the complaint itself faded into paperwork. Once the civil hearing formally closed, the process ended, the way most real consequences do, without spectacle. The decision itself was concise, grounded entirely in documentation and financial records, and it left no room for reinterpretation. Eric was held responsible for specific shared expenses. He could not substantiate legal costs generated by his own filings and additional fees tied to time and resources he had forced others to spend, correcting his claims. The amounts were not catastrophic, but they were enough to force adjustment. The professional fallout followed quietly. A consulting agreement he had been counting on was not renewed. A senior contact stopped returning calls. His name did not disappear from the industry, but it lost weight, the kind of reputational thinning that happens when people decide risk is no longer worth proximity. I wasn't present for the final administrative steps. Carol Stewart handled them, forwarded the summary, and confirmed there was nothing further required from me. That same afternoon, I closed every joint account we had once shared, checking savings, the credit line linked to both our names. Each closure generated a confirmation notice, impersonal and definitive. I updated passwords across personal accounts, removed secondary access points, and redirected all remaining correspondence to my attorney's office. A locksmith replaced the house locks while I was away, efficient and silent, leaving a small envelope with new keys on the counter. When I picked them up later, there was no sense of loss attached to the old ones, just the recognition that they were no longer needed. Any remaining communication from Eric was filtered automatically. I didn't read messages, didn't review missed calls, didn't ask what tone they carried. One final text slipped through before the block was complete, a short note saying this had gone further than it needed to, and that he hoped I would eventually see that. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just an attempt to soften the ending without accepting it. I didn't reply. I blocked the number, deleted the thread, and closed the phone without rereading the words. That was the last interaction. Nothing dramatic followed. Life returned to its smaller rhythms. I went grocery shopping in the early evening when the store was quiet, stood in line without checking notifications, cooked meals without timing them around anyone else's schedule. I cleared out a drawer that had collected things I no longer used, scheduled an overdue appointment, replaced a chipped mug I had kept out of habit. None of it felt symbolic. It was simply maintenance. One morning I woke up before my alarm and made coffee while the street outside was still dim. Cars passed intermittently, a neighbor walked by with a dog, and everything looked exactly as it always had. There was no urge to revisit the sequence of events or to frame them into a lesson. I didn't feel relief or triumph, just a steady absence where tension used to sit. I rinsed the mug, set it on the rack, picked up my keys, and left the house on time. There were no messages waiting, no unresolved conversations, no expectation that anything needed to be explained further. The connection was fully severed, not through confrontation or forgiveness, but through completion. What remained was a life no longer negotiated, no longer interrupted, and no longer shared with someone who had mistaken access for permanence. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.